You are listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Now, in case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, our organization, GRNC, has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies. A grassroots collection of people, volunteers to be exact, from all walks of life, who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are under attack. Please check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Well, this week, the Trump administration finally made good on its promise to ban so-called bump stocks. As you may recall, resting on the claim that bump stocks were used in the Las Vegas massacre, cries arose from the left and the right alike to ban the devices, which increased the rate of fire for semi-automatic firearms, I say again semi-automatic firearms, while still requiring one pull of the trigger for each shot fired. Now, maybe you don't care about bump stocks. You probably don't even own one. And no serious gun owner would want one. After all, they make it impossible to deliver accurate fire, and they just pretty much spray and pray. But as you will hear from our guest today, namely award-winning gun rights writer Dr. A.W.R. Hawkins, who writes for Breitbart.com, you had damn well better care. Not because of what was banned, but rather how they were banned. Specifically by torturing the English language to simply redefine what constitutes a machine gun, effectively saying, that's not what that means. Now, this is a method of banning guns that could be applied to any firearm. But more on that later from our guest, Dr. A.W.R. Hawkins. But first, please allow me to say Merry Christmas, you racist pig. We've been watching you, you know. First, there was that Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, that racist holiday cartoon that put Peanuts' sole black character, Franklin, on the wrong side of the Thanksgiving table, all by himself on a lawn chair, no less, while all the white characters sat in nice chairs on the opposite side. Now, all that baloney about Charles Schulz putting his career on the line to feature a black character back in the 1960s, all that's just window dressing. But Christmas? There, your racist, homophobic misogyny is really showing. First, you and your traditional American collaborators started playing Baby It's Cold Outside, the song that has been promoting date rape since 1944. But more than 100 of our comrades called in and got a radio station, namely Star 102 in Cleveland, to not only pull the song, but to even apologize for playing such a thing. We also know that you've been indoctrinating your children with that racist, sexist Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special for generations now. But we outed you on that, too, when our comrades wrote to the Huffington Post saying, and I quote, yearly reminder that hashtag Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is a parable a parable, on racism and homophobia, a parable on racism and homophobia, with Santa as a bigoted, exploitative prick. Then we have another tweet that said, Santa's operation is an HR nightmare and in serious need of diversity and inclusion training. Diversity and inclusion training. Okay. But don't you worry, we're winning, you know. We've already conquered academia, where people like Professor Eric Sprankle of Minnesota State University tweeted, and I quote, "The virgin birth story is about an all-knowing, all-powerful deity impregnating a human teen. There is no definition of consent that would include that scenario. Happy holidays." Better yet, we're getting Christmas removed from schools. Our latest victory was just weeks ago, when Jennifer Sinclair, the principal for Manchester Elementary School, banned the celebration of Christmas. Among the things she banned were Santas or Christmas items, including clip art on worksheets, Christmas trees in classrooms, heaven forbid, elf on a shelf, I never liked them anyway, singing Christmas carols, playing Christmas music, sending a scholastic book that is a Christmas book, making a Christmas ornament as a gift. This, after all, assumes that the family has a Christmas tree, which assumes they celebrate Christmas. Candy canes, red and green items. Yes, we're banning colors now. Reindeer. Now, does that mean the left is going to go out and kill all the reindeer? I don't know, but we're banning reindeer anyway. Christmas videos, movies, and or characters from Christmas stories, Christmas movies, excuse me. But perhaps most successful of all was our effort to eradicate the traditional American Christmas, which occurred this year at, of all places, the Illinois State Capitol, where right next to the Christmas tree and the menorah is a display of Satanism. Yes, Satanism. Illinois Secretary of State spokesman Dave Drucker even defended the satanic display, saying, and I quote, "Under the Constitution, the First Amendment, the people have a right to express their feelings, their thoughts. This recognizes that." Should they say their rights, their feelings, their thoughts, no matter how stupid? Anyway, I find it amazing that the left only recognizes the Constitution when it suits their purpose, but anyway. But maybe Donald Trump Jr. had it right and said it best when he weighed in on the Rudolph flap by saying, and I quote, "Liberalism is a disease." I initially contacted our guest today after seeing his article on Breitbart.com describing New Jersey's latest theft of individual freedom, the outright ban on standard capacity magazines holding more than 10 rounds, and how in the tradition of police states everywhere, the New Jersey State Police refused to rule out the possibility of going door to door to confiscate such devices. But then the Trump administration trumped that by announcing the so-called Bumpstock ban, and I decided to discuss his even better article on the full implications of that. So we will return shortly with our distinguished guest and award-winning writer at Breitbart.com, Dr. A.W.R. Hawkins, and his thoughts on why the pending Bumpstock ban is not only a threat to owners of the devices, but to all gun owners. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. We will return shortly with more details on how you can better defend your gun rights.
I really can't stay.
Baby, it's cold outside.
I've got to go away.
But baby, it's cold outside.
This evening has
Been hoping that you
so
drop in.
very nice.
I'll hold your hands, they're just like
My
ice.
mother will start to
Beautiful,
worry.
what
And
you
Father
have.
will be pacing the floor.
Listen to the fireplace
So
roar.
really I'd better scurry.
Beautiful, please don't
Well,
hurry.
maybe just a half a drink
Put
more.
some records on while I pour.
Neighbors mind
Baby, it's bad out there.
Say, what's in this
No
drink?
cabs to be had out there.
I wish I knew how
Your eyes are like starlight
to
now.
break the spell.
I'll take your hat, your hair looks
I ought to
swell.
say no, no,
Mind
no,
if
sir.
I'm moving
At least
closer?
I'm gonna say that I tried.
What's the sense of hurting my pride?
I really can't stand.
Baby, don't hold out.
Ah, but
Baby, it's cold outside.
My name is Paul Valona, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt's Gun Shop, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Today we have as our guest A.W.R. Hawkins, who is an award-winning Second Amendment columnist for Breitbart News, the host of Breitbart podcast Bullets with A.W.R. Hawkins, and the writer-curator of Downrange with A.W.R. Hawkins, a weekly newsletter focused on all things Second Amendment, also for Breitbart News. He is the political analyst for Armed American Radio. Dr. Hawkins, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Paul, great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, yesterday, the Department of Justice finally announced the long-anticipated ban on so-called bump stocks. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that ban does?
Well, what that ban does is it alters language in the National Firearms Act, which was passed in 1934, and it redefines bump stocks so that they are machine guns. And that's what the language says anyway. And that doesn't mean that a gun with a bump stock is a machine gun. They're saying the bump stock itself is now defined as a machine gun. And their solution to this is to ban them altogether. Now, there's some problems with that maybe you and I are going to flesh out, but so I won't run ahead of myself. But I've pretty much summed up the ban for you, and there are myriad problems with it linguistically and otherwise.
So basically what they're doing is they're redefining what a machine gun is, because it used to be a single pull of the trigger would fire more than one round. And of course, for those who aren't familiar with the function of a bump stock, essentially it's a sliding stock that simply allows you to articulate the trigger more quickly, but actually still only delivers one shot per pull of the trigger. Would you not agree?
100% correct. And even in their definition in the ban, I spoke yesterday to the DOJ for about a half hour on a phone call, and I said, look, even in your definition, you admit that the bump stock allows the trigger to reset after each shot. And they say, yeah, but it's one actuation. No, it's not. If the trigger resets, then it has to be re-pulled. It doesn't mean the finger necessarily leaves the trigger, but you do pull the trigger every time a shot is fired, even with a bump stock on.
Well, AWR, you have to understand it depends on what the definition of is. I guess anybody who can torture the English language. Anyways, the wrinkle here, in addition to what you just mentioned, is that these so-called machine guns were not registered before May of 1986 under the Hughes Amendment to the McClure-Volkmer Act. They can't be registered, and if they're still owned, they must be surrendered or destroyed within 90 days. Is that your interpretation?
Well, that's what they're saying, but I find this to be a stretch. You know what they're doing ultimately is you have the DOJ making law. Now they avoid that by saying it's not a law, it's a rule. But this is still extra constitutional action or extra congressional action. And they're making laws telling us what we can and can't do. And I spoke to them about that yesterday, too. I said, this is very scary because next year you could expand the language to include Glock handguns. And what are we supposed to do? If they do that, we just have to surrender them? Is that what we're supposed to do? Is that how they're training us? This is very troublesome.
That's an excellent analogy, as a matter of fact. Why don't we just redefine handgun as a machine gun, and therefore you'd have to turn that in as well. Interesting point that I actually had not considered. So gun owners have 90 days to comply, or else they face prosecution. What happens if they get caught with one of these so-called machine guns?
My understanding is it's a felony. So I think they made a severe enough penalty that law-abiding citizens are going to comply. And the DOJ official with whom I spoke yesterday told me point blank, I said, are you going to go door to door? Because I said, this ban seems unenforceable to me. You don't have serial numbers on these products. You don't know who has them, who doesn't. He said, we're not going to go door to door. And he said, but I believe law-abiding Americans will comply. And, just the way he talked, it's very demeaning to the law-abiding American. And he basically expects everyone to toe the line. But the enforcement vehicle is going to be very difficult for them. So they've made the penalty so severe. And he said yesterday, as I said, that he said, I'm confident that there will be wide compliance. So they think they've done enough to scare us into playing along.
Well, first off, you're right. I think it's, as I interpret this thing, if they've made a machine gun out of it, possession of an unregistered machine gun is a 10-year federal felony under the 1934 National Firearms Act. And so, that's a pretty severe penalty, which, by the way, on other unregistered NFA weapons, the ATF has been very anxious to prosecute. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. Well, it's not the kind of thing you want to mess around with. I'll just put it that way. But I have a problem. As you're speaking, of course, what they did. If you think about how sneaky this was, instead of redefining a Bumpstock as a different type of product regulated by the NFA, they made sure they said machine gun. And that way they could justify their call to hand them over or destroy them, as you said, based on the 1986 Act. And the thing is, if they had labeled these as suppressors or another weapon or whatever they had done, these would have been things that we could have kept if we owned them, registered, and used as we do with other NFA-regulated weapons. But they did everything they could do to wipe these out.
Well, the other wrinkle to that is, I realize what you said about the DOJ being very optimistic about people turning these things in. But for starters, as soon as they started talking about banning them, everybody and their brother went out and bought one, even if they didn't have one. And none of these things have a registration number, or a serial number. There's absolutely no way to track them. Wouldn't you agree? Right.
Absolutely no way. I mean, I spoke to a friend yesterday who works for another federal agency in law enforcement, and he laughed at this whole deal. He goes, the only way they'll be able to catch you is if you commit a crime with it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that to people to encourage law breaking. I'm just saying he laughed out loud. He's like, this is unenforceable.
Well, I think based on what we saw, for example, in the Connecticut assault weapon ban up there and the relatively small number of people who actually registered or turned in firearms, I think we're probably going to see an infinitesimal rate of compliance. I mean, once again, I'm not saying I encourage that, but it's just the reality that people are basically going to raise a middle finger to the DOJ, in my estimation.
Well, I think you're probably right.
Now, the other thing is, what are the constitutional implications of this? I mean, wouldn't that be a taking of property under the Fifth Amendment without due process of law? There's no compensation. It's not even like a buyback that Australia did, for crying out loud.
Right. No, you're right. And we talked about that on that call again. I mean, and I keep referencing that call just because I was so astounded at the arrogance. I said, will you be compensating people who turn in these legally purchased products? And he said, no plan for compensation. And, of course, no grandfathering. We've already covered that. And so it seems to violate the takings clause. When the Third Circuit let the New Jersey magazine bandstand, they did it on the grounds that the magazines could be altered and therefore saved, so they weren't necessarily being taken. I don't agree with that argument, but that's the one they put.
At least
forward.
it's a fig leaf. There's not even a fig leaf here.
Hand them over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you. There's not even a fig leaf on this. There's not even any attempt to make a case. And, I mean, already, I guess, at least two organizations, including Gun Owners of America, have said they're going to sue. I've asked for our organization, Grassroots North Carolina, I've asked our Director of Legal Research to start putting together an amicus brief on it. So I think it's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight. For the next couple of years, we might end up right back where we were yesterday or the day before, don't you think?
I think there's a better than a good chance. I mean, as I say, in their own language is at war with itself. You can't say that this fires with one actuation of the trigger and at the same time say the trigger resets after each round is fired. You cannot say those kinds of things. There are too many loopholes in what not loopholes. There are too many disagreements in what they have written. They're in disagreement with themselves.
Fundamental conflicts. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. We're going to have to take a break right now. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. After our short break, we will return with more on the Bumpstock ban and more critical information better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. We have as our guest today award-winning Second Amendment author A.W.R. Hawkins of Breitbart.com, and we are talking about the so-called Bumpstock ban just announced by the Department of Justice, which is being done as a change in regulation and, in fact, a change in the interpretation of what constitutes a machine gun for the purposes of the National Firearms Act of 1934. They have essentially redefined bump stocks to be machine guns, and because they were all manufactured after the McClure-Volkmer Act of 1986, they cannot legally be registered and owned by private citizens, meaning that anyone who has one of these devices has 90 days to either destroy it or turn it in without any type of constitution, as Dr. Hawkins quite correctly noted, probably in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Now, Dr. Hawkins, according to your article at Breitbart.com, the NRA is now distancing itself from this ruling, yet they were calling for this regulation after the Las Vegas shootings. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how we got here?
Right. Well, after the Las Vegas shooting, Congress, various members of Congress, Democrats most of them, but some Republicans, to their shame, pushed a bump stock ban. And there was no public support for it, and it waned and then finally disappeared. And the NRA put out a statement saying that that Congress should be allowed to do their job, and that the federal agencies should take another look at this, particularly the ATF, and see if this is still a product that should be allowed to be sold as it has been sold to the public since 2010. So after that, President Trump asked federal agencies to look into this. In December 2017, the ATF sent around a form for public comment to get public comment on a ban. In February of 2018, Trump said he was going to direct the DOJ to go ahead and finish it and do the ban. And then yesterday, I think, which is the 18th or the 17th, I don't remember yesterday's date, but the ban was announced. It is expected to be in the Federal Register this Friday. And then from that point forward, people have 90 days to destroy them or turn them in. So says the DOJ.
I see. So basically, there was no appetite in Congress for passing legislation on this stuff. So the DOJ essentially regulated it by simply changing the regulations. Now, the NRA actually had asked for this type of regulation as opposed to legislation. How did that work out for them exactly?
Well, apparently not well, because yesterday they gave statements saying that they wish there had been a grandfather clause included in the DOJ's summary of the ban, that people who bought these under former ATF regulations ought to be able to own them and keep them. But the thing is, Paul, once you let the monster out of the box, the monster's out of the box. You can't let him out and then say, I wish you had worn a yellow shirt, not a red one. It's too late at that point. And so that's where we are.
Yeah, I that's exactly my read on it. Unfortunately, some of the gun rights organizations, just a few, have adopted a tactic I call preemptive concession, wherein they say, well, if we pass gun ban light, then maybe they won't pass gun ban full. And it seems to me that all that does is to give them half of the loaf, and they're immediately back for the other half. In this case, immediately, truly immediately back for the other half, which in this case is to ban them completely rather than grandfathering the existing devices, to the owners that have them. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, I think a perfect example of what you're talking about is the fact that we adopted background checks in 1998, and my memory doesn't go back far enough to think of a time that Democrats weren't pushing universal background checks. Background checks at retail aren't enough. We have to have background checks everywhere. And it's the same kind of issue we're going to see here. Preemptively, you give them a bump stock ban, and now they'll be happy. No way. They're going to use a Bumpstock ban to try to get a semi-automatic rifle ban. You hide and watch.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we've experienced that right here in North Carolina in 1993, before I was on watch, I will note, and before our organization in Grassroots North Carolina existed. The previous organizations, NRA affiliates, allowed to pass a mandatory gun storage law, which was relatively benign. It only punished people if a resident minor got a hold of and misused a firearm. But then back in about 2000, they went for the rest of the loaf of bread and actually introduced yet another mandatory, closing the loopholes of the existing mandatory gun storage law. That's what they called it. And actually introduced something far more draconian, which would have allowed me to be prosecuted even if I kept the guns locked up and even if they were stolen from my home by a minor. And so the lesson here is giving them something does not prevent them from going for the rest. When we see gun control, we need to oppose all gun control without compromise. Would that be your understanding?
Well, 100%. I don't want to run too far afield, but when the Democrats keep telling us there is support for universal gun control or universal background checks, and what will they hurt and this and that? You have to oppose them tooth and nail. I don't care if 99% of the American people in a poll support them. You have to oppose it tooth and nail because it is insidious. All gun control is insidious, and for that reason alone, I oppose every piece of gun control I see.
Yeah, and believe me, you aren't going too far afield, because what we need to do on something like this is we need to learn, people need to recognize what the tactics of the left are and the tactics of the gun control advocates, because essentially they're never going to be happy. There is no such thing as a common sense gun law that they'll be happy with until the complete ownership of firearms is banned. I interpret that as to be their ultimate goal. Would you agree?
I agree 100%. And anybody who doubts what you're saying, just look at, when you tell someone look at Nazi Germany or look at China, look at these different countries, they always turn their back and they're like, oh, there you go with Nazi Germany. So I'm going to say something different. Just look at California. California passed universal background checks in the 1990s. They followed that with registration requirements, gun confiscation laws, assault weapons bans, magazine bans, waiting periods. I could go on and on and on. And what do they have? They have an increase in violence this year as far as crime goes, or it would be last year because it's the latest records. So this stuff doesn't work, but they don't care that it's not working. They just keep passing one more law, and make it harder and harder to get a gun for self-defense.
Well, we people, because most of us are honest people, we assume they have honest intentions. The fact is they're not interested in controlling crime. They're interested in controlling you and I. So
that's it.
All right. So we've got two organizations that are going to file litigation on this thing, Gun Owners of America and I believe the Firearms Policy Coalition. And once again, I believe we're probably going to be back here, right at the position we were in a couple of days ago, if in fact it goes to the Supreme Court and they strike it down. At least that is my hope. How do you feel about the Trump administration in general? Some people are actually denouncing the Trump administration on this. Where do you think that the administration really stands on guns?
I believe that Trump, by and large, can be trusted on the Second Amendment. I really do. But I believe it's part of his nature as deal-making that he has a tendency to do a couple of things that I would never do. This Bumpstock is one of them, this Bumpstock ban. And it kind of lines up with the earlier comments you were making. Sometimes in deal-making, he feels like if he throws out a little bit of this to them, he can get more of what he wants. But when it comes to gun control, it just doesn't work that way because they are never satisfied.
Yeah, and I think he's probably learning some of that right now with the wall negotiations with the Democrats, but that's another matter. All right. Essentially now, let us. Why don't you tell people where they can find your material and where they can read your stuff, because you write some absolutely spot-on articles for Breitbart and elsewhere. So tell us how we can find your stuff, please.
Oh, thank you, Paul. You can find me on Twitter at AWR Hawkins. You can find me on Instagram at AWR Hawkins AWR Hawkins, excuse me. But you can find me at Breitbart every day, Breitbart.com, and that's where everything I write posts every day.
I'm sure everybody knows that, but Breitbart.com is just an incredible source of information. AWR, thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It was so great to be with you, Paul. I appreciate it.
Okay, folks, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with more critical information on how you, as a gun owner, can avoid becoming an accidental felon and better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. In our last segment, our distinguished guest, Dr. A.W.R. Hawkins, who writes gun issues for Breitbart.com, described the dangers of the recent Bumpstock ban, in particular how it could be a precedent for simply redefining what constitutes various types of firearms for purposes of future bans without the benefit of the legislative process. As an addendum to our last segment on the pending Bumpstock ban, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, has helpfully published a reference on how you can either turn in or destroy your Bumpstock. That would be your private property. No mention is made of compensation for that property, of course. And make no mistake, the ATF is very specific about how your device must be destroyed, where it must be cut, and how in order to disable it. Or, of course, you can turn it in after calling to make an appointment, of course. You have to make an appointment to give up your rights and your personal property. The ban takes place 90 days after the rule is published in the Federal Register, which presumably will be sometime in late March. The next part is very important, and I want you to listen carefully. Continued possession of a bump stock after the date of the ban takes effect will be construed as possession of an unregistered machine gun, and no, there is no provision for registering it, as we previously discussed. Unregistered machine gun which will subject you to prosecution of what is a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. You can check out details of how to surrender or destroy your bump stock, courtesy of the ATF, at atf.gov/ and hyphenate all these words, rules and regulations / bump stocks / how to destroy. Now for a little segue, which I will call your future under gun control. This is exactly what you can expect if guns are banned in this country. Venezuela, baby, it's where it's at for socialism. This from Fox News, and I quote, "As Venezuela continues to crumble under the socialist dictatorship of President Nicolas Maduro, some are expressing words of warning and resentment against a 6-year-old gun control bill that stripped citizens of their weapons." They quote a citizen here, quote, "Guns would have served as a vital pillar to remaining a free people, or at least able to put up a fight," Javier Venegas, 28, a Venezuelan teacher of English now exiled in Ecuador, told Fox News. The government security forces at the beginning of this debacle knew they had no real opposition to their force. Once things were this bad, it was a clear declaration of war against an unarmed population. See if that sounds dire. Under the direction of then-President Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan National Assembly in 2012 enacted, quote, "control of arms, munitions, and disarmament law," with the explicit aim to, and I quote, "disarm all citizens." The law took effect in 2013 with only minimal pushback from some pro-democracy opposition figures, banned the legal commercial sales of guns and munitions to all except governmental entities. Sounds like exactly what our gun control people want. Chavez initially ran a months-long amnesty program encouraging Venezuelans to trade their arms for electrical goods. What a great trade. That year, there were only 37 recorded voluntary gun surrenders, 37. While the majority of seizures, more than 12,500, were, wait for it, by force. In 2014, with Nicolas Maduro at the helm following Chavez's death, but carrying through his socialist Chavista policies, the government invested more than $47 million enforcing the gun ban, which has since included, and see if this sounds familiar, grandiose displays of public weapons demolitions in the town square. See any politicians running over guns with a bulldozer recently? Describing apathy and ignorance, which perfectly describes the United States, the Fox News piece goes on to quote the Venezuelan as saying, quote, "Venezuelans didn't care enough about it. The idea of having the means to protect your home was seen as only needed in the fields. People never would have believed they needed to defend themselves against the government," Vanegas explained. "Venezuelans evolved to always hope that our government would be non-tyrannical, a non-violator of human rights, and would always have a good enough control of criminality." So much for relying on hope. He said it didn't take long for such a wide-eyed public perception to fall apart. Quote, If guns had been a stronger part of our culture, if there had been any sense of duty for one to protect their individual rights, and as a show of force against a government power, and had legal carry been a common thing, it would have made a huge difference, he lamented. A parable for all of us. I'm a movie buff. Every now and again I find a truly significant film which has truly significant things to say about individual freedom and its necessary counterpart, individual privacy. I saw just one such film recently named Anon, written and directed by Andrew Niccol and starring Clive Owen and Amanda Seyfried. Niccol's previous movies include Lord of War, The Truman Show, and one of my personal favorites, Gattaca, a futuristic movie about a totalitarian society in which the ruling principle is eugenics, where your future is dictated by your genetic makeup. Wikipedia describes Anon at least as well as I could, so allow me to quote it. Set in a futuristic world where privacy and anonymity no longer exist, the plot follows a troubled detective who comes across a young woman who has evaded the government's transparency system. In a modern world where advanced biosign implants mean everyone is subjected to a relentless visual stream of information they call the mind's eye, privacy and anonymity as we know it have vanished. With everyone's personal information on public display and each person's life recorded down to the millisecond, personal information is downloaded to a vast grid called the ether. Now, what I found personally most compelling about the movie was one of the characters, who is both antagonist and protagonist, a woman whose name is unknown because she has figured out how to defeat the system which keeps everyone under perpetual surveillance. I won't spoil the plot, but suffice to say she is suspected of a series of essentially unsolvable murders made unsolvable by her ability to escape surveillance. At the very end of the movie, there is a line I want you to remember and which I want you to repeat each time, every time, someone you know says of this or that governmental invasion of privacy, "I don't mind. I don't have anything to hide." Owen tries to convince her to give up her privacy, saying, "You get rid of other people's secrets. What's yours?" Seyfried responds, "Does there have to be one?" Owen replies, "Everyone has something to hide." In the closing line, she responds, "It's not that I have something to hide. I have nothing I want you to see." My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at hyattguns.com. I also encourage you to register your opinion or suggestions for future shows at my website, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. Spell out the "and," by the way, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. Meanwhile, we will see you next Sunday at 5, and in the meantime, I want you to respond to each and every happy holidays you hear with the following words. Merry Christmas.
I wish I knew
Your
how
eyes are like starlight
to
now.
break the spell.
I'll take your hat, your hair looks
I'll just
swell.
say no, no, no,
Mind if
sir.
I'm moving
At least
closer?
I'm gonna say that I tried.
What's the sense of hurting my pride?
I really can't stand.
Baby, don't hold out.
Ah, but
Baby,
it's
it's cold.